Good afternoon, I'm Peter Jones, and for 10 years I was the Professor of Operations Management at the University of Surrey, or as the press release that announced my appointment stated, I was the world's first and only Professor of in-flight catering. I'm also the author of the book Flight Catering, the only book that deals in depth with this subject. During my 10 years as the in-flight catering professor, I met many people who, when I told them what I did, immediately told me what they thought of airline meals. And I regret to say that lots of people didn't have a very high opinion of airline meals. This made me interested in why this might be the case, since I knew that caterers and airlines spent a lot of time trying to get the airline meal to be as good as it possibly could be. And it turns out, of course, that the airline meal, although it is a good meal on the ground, doesn't necessarily taste the same when it's consumed in the air. And this is to do with the conditions that you find in the aircraft cabin. There are two main issues. First of all, because the way the air is circulated, there is very low humidity. And this means that passengers, when they're eating their meal, are dehydrated. This dehydration has two effects. One is it affects the sense of smell, which greatly affects how we taste things, as well as affects the taste buds in the mouth. The other factor on board is the low pressure. In an aircraft cabin, it's the same as if we were about 2,000 meters above sea level, whereas most of us live at sea level. That change in air pressure not only affects our ears, but it also affects our taste buds too. Another effect of low air pressure is that digestion is slowed down, and this again may affect people's sense of appetite. There's also the effect that alcohol consumption on an aircraft has on digestion and people's perception of food. Because of the dehydration, people may tend to drink slightly faster and more, and because of the low humidity and air pressure, it's absorbed into the bloodstream much quicker. And alcohol dulls the sense of taste and indeed has a whole range of effects which in its extreme forms we see as air rage. Now, airlines and caterers know this and they adjust their recipes to take into account the effect that dehydration and humidity might have on our sense of taste. But I think there are other factors too which affect passengers' perception of food. And these are more psychological and social than physiological. The psychological effects on passengers are all connected with fear of flying and being tired from the journey, and also concern about arriving on time and making sure that everything's fine when you get to your destination. And then again, socially, it's not the done thing. It's not fashionable to say that you like your airline meals and so forth. So all in all, airline meals can have a bad reputation for the physiological reasons of trying to consume food on a plane where it's dry and low pressure, the psychological factors and the social factors. What I think is perhaps more interesting is the implications this has for measuring passenger satisfaction. The typical way of doing that, of course, is to ask them, are you satisfied with your meal on a 5 or 7-point scale, and ask them to rate it. But research at Surrey that's currently ongoing, and my own anecdotal evidence, is that this might be the wrong way of asking the question. And that's because it assumes that we're dealing with a normal population. And when I say a normal population, I mean a population that follows the bell-shaped curve that we're all familiar with in statistics. And that means that people average around the mean and the extremes are extremely small. But the research that we've done and the people that I've talked to suggest that it's not an average population, that there are actually two groups of people. One group of people are those who quite like or are happy with an airline meal, but there's another and large significant group who basically do not like the whole notion of eating on board an aeroplane. Now, if you ask two groups of people if they're satisfied with a meal, you may end up with a bell-shaped response and an average score, but it actually doesn't tell you very much about those two groups of people. So what you might need to do is to ask the question in a different way, which is what the research that we're doing at the University of Surrey is doing. We're asking people how they view airline meals in general, what their predisposition towards the airline meal is. And what we're tending to find is that there are these two groups. Now, it means that those two groups will rate those meals differently. And therefore, knowing what kind of passenger you have on board before you ask them if they're satisfied with their meal becomes quite important. So I would suggest that if you're going to survey passengers, one of the things you might do is to add a question that says, how do you feel about eating on board a plane in general terms? Or what's your general attitude towards airline meals? Before you ask the question, how do you rate the meal that you've had on the plane today? The other way of doing it is not to ask them to rate the meal on a satisfaction scale, but to ask the question, how would you rate your meal relative to other airline meals that you have had in the past? Is it better than the previous meals you've had, the same as, or worse than? And I think if you ask those questions on your passenger surveys, you're more likely to get an effective response that tells you more about how well the meal is being perceived by passengers. If you've been interested in the things I've had to say in this short video, please keep an eye open for some books that will become available for download through the iStore. These interactive books will be a complete update of the flight catering textbook, but rather than be printed, they will be downloaded onto your iPad just for the price of a Happy Meal. Thank you very much.